Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Executive Director of the Ronald Reagan Foundation and Institute, Mr. John Highbush.
Good evening, everyone. My name's John Highbush. I have the distinction of being the Executive Director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Library. Thank you all for coming out this evening. If you would, in honor of our men and women who protect our freedoms every day around the world in uniform, please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. Before we get started this evening, I'd like to take a moment to recognize a couple of special guests we have with us in the audience. Former Congressman Elton Gallegly and his terrific wife, Janice. Elton. Now, if you would, please join me in enjoying a brief video that will help to introduce our speaker this evening.
When South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley was sworn in, she became the state's first female governor.
Results are what I promised the people of South Carolina, and results is what I'm determined to give them.
Governor Nikki Haley says it is the single largest economic investment in the state's more than 200-year history.
Mercedes-Benz vans, full manufacturing right here in Charleston County.
It is a great day in South Carolina.
$560 million invested, 1,700 jobs right here in Chester County. It's a great win. So the best part of what has happened over the past couple of years is watching all of these jobs not just go into cities, but go into rural South Carolina. Because if you can give a person a job, you take care of a family. And we watched a lot of families get taken care of over the past couple of years.
President-elect Trump has asked South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley to be his ambassador to the United Nations, and she's accepted. The daughter of Indian immigrants is considered a rising star in the Republican Party. Haley would be the first woman appointed to Trump's cabinet.
Our new ambassador to the United Nations is living proof of the promise of America.
For anyone that says you can't get anything done at the UN, they need to know there's a new sheriff in town.
There is a new U.S. UN. You are going to see a change in the way we do business. For those that don't have our back, we're taking names. For too long, the Human Rights Council has been a protector of human rights abusers and a cesspool of political bias.
If, for any reason, North Korea attacks the United States or our allies, the U.S. will respond, period.
She's so tough. And she's so consistent. And you just know you're not going to move her.
The Americans just said we want our embassy in the capital, and that capital is Jerusalem.
America will put our embassy in Jerusalem. That is what the American people want us to do. And it is the right thing to do. No vote in the United Nations will make any difference on that.
What we witnessed here today in the Security Council is an insult. It won't be forgotten.
Standing her ground, UN Ambassador Nikki Haley making it clear.
I will not shut up. Rather, I will respectfully speak some hard truths.
Haley shows us what American foreign policy looks like with the spine.
Some people say there's a little too much swagger. You know that.
I don't think it's swagger. I think it's passion. I am very passionate about defending the United States.
As Nikki said, the world is really respecting the United States again.
Didn't know that I would be elected into the legislature. I didn't know that I would be governor. I certainly never thought I would be UN ambassador.
Even though I'm a private citizen now, I know I'm too young to stop fighting.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my honor to invite Fred Ryan, Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, and our special guest this evening, Ambassador Haley, to the stage.
You are right there. Thank you, John. Well done. Well, good evening. Thank you, John. Welcome, everyone, to the Reagan Presidential Library, and thank you for joining us for what I know will be a fascinating conversation. Tonight, we are privileged to host a leader who shares many characteristics with our 40th president. As a former governor, Ronald Reagan recognized that our republic functions best when leadership and innovation come from the states. Nikki Haley's creativity and leadership attracted more than $20 billion in new capital investment and record-breaking job creation during her time as governor of South Carolina. President Reagan knew that a world free and at peace requires unapologetic strength from the United States. As America's ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley was fearless in standing up for the United States and our allies and against tyrants who were hostile to American values. A key part of President Reagan's success was his willingness to upend standard practice in Washington. In fact, he once famously said the word status quo is actually the Latin translation for the mess we're in. Nikki Haley is no lover of the status quo. She describes herself as a disruptor and has the record to prove it by shaking up the good old boy network in South Carolina, by ending business as usual at the United Nations, and by providing a powerful voice for reform in American politics. And President Reagan was beloved for his optimism about our country and his belief in the American dream. He would have loved the story of Nikki Haley. She is a daughter of immigrants who left comfortable lives in India to give their children the greatest gift they could imagine, the limitless opportunity that comes with being an American. Governor Haley has recorded many of the lessons from these experiences in her new book, With All Due Respect, Defending America with Grit and Grace. That's a great combination, grit and grace. We look forward to hearing her observations from her political life and her thoughts on America's future this evening. Please join me in welcoming to the Reagan Presidential Library, Ambassador Nikki Haley. Well, thank you. Good. Well, welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you. It is such an honor to be the small town girl from Bamberg, South Carolina, to be in the Reagan Library. It doesn't get any cooler than that, so this is great.
Well, we are delighted to have you here. We have a number of questions. And I thought maybe we'd talk a little about lessons you've learned as governor, lessons at the United Nations, and a little bit about your view of the world and some of your life experiences along the way.
Well, you know, I think that you have to first know how I was raised. I was born and raised in a small town in South Carolina. We were the only Indian family. We weren't white enough to be white. We weren't black enough to be black. My father wears a turban. My mother wore a sari. They didn't know who we were, what we were, or why we were there. And I remember after being teased on the playground, I would come home and my mom would always say, your job is not to show them how you're different. Your job is to show them how you're similar. And it's amazing how that lesson on the playground played out in my life in the corporate world as governor and as ambassador, because whenever you're faced with challenges, if you first talk about what you have in common, then people let their guard down. And then usually you can take on the challenge and get closer to a solution. And I think that was really the lesson that I learned that played out in both of those roles.
Well, you start early in your book, and you tell a story a little bit about that. And I know you've been on the national stage as governor, you've been on the international stage as our UN ambassador, but your first time on the stage was as a young girl in the We Miss Bamberg pageant. Could you tell us a little bit about that and the lessons you learned?
So it was the big thing to do in Bamberg. Like
all the moms wanted to put their daughters in the We Miss Bamberg pageant. So my mother was no different, and she put me and my sister in the pageant. At the time, there was a white queen and there was a black queen. And so we didn't fit, so they disqualified us. So I was 4 years old, my sister was 8, they disqualified us, and my mom said, "Can you at least let Nikki sing her song? She's been practicing for a long time." No, you're not ready. You know what the song was? "This land is your land, this land is my land." You can't make that up. But that, that was the times. I can tell you, I swore off pageants after that. That was.
Let me just talk about your book, and starting off with the title, With All Due Respect. Can you tell us the story behind that?
So we were hot in the motions of really fighting off Russia. I think that in this administration, and I talk about in the book, while people may think the president's words are soft, we were very hard on our actions against Russia. And so a lot of what we had done was we had expelled multiple diplomats. We did military training with Ukraine. We sent them arms, which they hated. We put sanctions on them. And this was a different meeting of the National Security Council that we were having, and we all decided with the president's leadership that we were going to put sanctions on Russia again. So made that decision. The next day I talked with the president. We're still moving forward on that. I never did Sunday shows unless the White House asked me to. And so the White House asked me to do the Sunday shows, bless you. And then so I went to do Face the Nation. And when I was doing Face the Nation, she talked about Russia. And I said, well, you're going to see us put down sanctions if Secretary Mnuchin hasn't announced those already. Fast forward to that afternoon, and Stephen Mnuchin, who's a dear friend, called me and said, we have a problem. And I said, what's the problem? And he said, the president changed his mind. Now, the president has every right to change his mind. I mean, that's the president. You can decide up until the last minute to do that. So he had decided that he wanted to postpone those sanctions on Russia. And I said, okay, that's fine. Just put a statement out there and say that. So the next morning, they put a statement out, but they don't really say that. So the press is all on me. They are all on the issue, saying Nikki would never have said this had there not been something to it. So I called the chief of staff. I called the Secretary of State. I called the security advisor, Bolton. And I told all of them, I said, look, you need to come out and just tell the truth. There's nothing wrong with the president doing this. Tell the truth, because the press is on us. They're not going to stop. I mean, being governor, I know the press pretty well in terms of when they don't stop. Nothing happens. The next morning, the press is even at more heightened alert. And I contact those people again, and I go, look, either you say it by 5 o'clock today, or I'm going to say it by 5 o'clock today. And trust me, you don't want me to say it. 4:45. Larry Kudlow goes out to do a media veil, knowing that they were going to get asked that question. They asked him the question, and he said, well, I think Nikki was momentarily confused. I looked at the television, and my friend Dana Perino had just come on with the 5, and I texted her, and I said, can you call me? She called me, and she said, what's up? I said, I need to put out a statement. And she said, okay, well, how do you want to send it to me? And I said, no, I'll tell it to you right now. I said, just say, with all due respect, I don't get confused. She said, is that it? And I go, that's it. I'll text it to you so that you have it in writing. She says it. She gets it out there. 10 minutes, Larry Kudlow calls, Nikki, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have done it. I'm sorry. I'll make it up to you. And I said, you will make it up to me. You're going to call the press and tell them the truth. And he goes, I can't do that. And I go, oh, no, you can, and you will. And he, to his credit, 10 minutes later, he had talked to the press, and all of it went away. And, you know, the moral of that story is no one is going to defend your integrity but yourself. And when you see something, or if something like that happens, you have to fight for yourself. You have to fight for what you know is right. And so I did.
Thank you.
The surprising thing was that was just, to me, a small issue that was playing out from the administration standpoint. The next thing I know, there's sweatshirts and there's mugs and there's T-shirts that are all saying "with all due respect." And so it turned out to be this phenomenon that they were all saying that they don't get confused. So I think a lot of you have been in that same situation.
Right. You've started a movement.
That's right.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about when you were governor, and it had to be one of the hardest times when you were governor because there was a horrific shooting at the Mother Emanuel Church, and you found time after that to attend the funerals of all of the victims. That must have been very hard. Can you tell us how you managed to do that?
It was unbelievably hard. It was, I think, the biggest challenge I've been through in my life. I think that obviously the hardest thing that the people of South Carolina had gone through, what you had was 12 people who did what so many South Carolinians do every Wednesday night. They went to Bible study. But on this night, someone else showed up. He didn't look like them. He didn't act like them. He didn't sound like them. They didn't throw him out. They didn't call the cops. Instead, they pulled up a chair and prayed with him for an hour. And when they went to bow their heads in that last prayer, he began to shoot. These were people like Ethel Lance, whose daughter had died 2 years prior to breast cancer, and she had a broken heart. But she would go around Mother Emanuel cleaning the church, singing, "One day at a time, sweet Jesus, that's all I ask of you. Give me the strength to do every day what I have to do." Our youngest victim, Tywanza Sanders, just graduated college, had the world in front of him. And on that night, he stood in front of his 87-year-old great Aunt Susie and looked at the killer and said, "You don't have to do this. We mean no harm to you." Or people like Cynthia Hurd, whose life motto was simply to be kinder than necessary. That's who these people were. They weren't famous, but they loved their church, they loved their family, they loved their community. Mother Emanuel is the oldest African-American church in the South, and this was the first time we had had a shooting in a place of worship. And the spirit of South Carolina was broken. The media came in just so aggressively, wanting to define the moment. They wanted it to be about the death penalty. They wanted it to be about racism. They wanted it to be about gun control. And I just so wanted to protect my state. And I tried to strong-arm them and say, there will be a time and place where we will talk about all of those things, but it is not now. We want to get through the funerals. And the next day, the killer's manifesto came out, and there he was with the Confederate flag all over it, just spewing hate. We got through the 9 funerals. They were all open casket. You saw the loved ones just falling over their family members, and it was just a brutal time. But after the manifesto came out, I knew that this was the moment that we needed to bring the Confederate flag down. It had been a contentious debate for decades. You had many people who saw the Confederate flag and saw it as hate and slavery and evil. You had another segment of the population who didn't see it as racism. They saw it as part of their heritage and sacrifice and Southern traditions. As a governor, you don't judge your people. You don't say that one side is evil or the other. You go and try and move your state to the right direction. So after I had basically decided I wanted to bring the flag down, I talked with my husband about it to make sure I was thinking in a way that could happen. He agreed. So I asked my closest advisors to come to the residence, and I said, I want to have 4 meetings Monday morning. Don't tell them what it's about, because I knew they wouldn't show up to the meeting if they knew, because it was that controversial. And I met with a group of Republicans. The second meeting was with a group of Democrats. The third was with our congressional delegation. And the fourth was with community leaders. And I told each group, I said, I'm going to call for the flag to come down today at 4 o'clock. And if you will stand with me, I will forever be grateful. And if you don't, I won't ever let anyone know that you were in this room. And I had my husband there with me because I was so scared nobody was going to be standing with me at 4 o'clock. But I was so relieved because we had a great crowd with us. We had Strom Thurmond's son, who was a state senator. We had African-American leaders, and we went through what was a tough time. Through all of this, when the killer had to face the judge for the first time, the judge allowed the family members to speak to him. And one by one, unprompted, unplanned, they forgave him. It was the kind of forgiveness that so many of us couldn't comprehend. But we didn't have riots, we had vigils. We didn't have protests, we had hugs. And when it came time for the debate, one of the victims of the church shooting was a state senator. He was actually the pastor of the church. And when I found out about the killing, the night of the shooting, not knowing exactly what had happened, the first thing I did was call him. And I said, Senator, I just heard about the shooting at Mother Emanuel. I've got my investigators on their way there now. I will be there first thing in the morning. We'll do whatever we need for the families. I'm just so very sorry. He was supposed to be in the legislature that day. That's why I called him. And it haunts me to this day that when I called him, the phone was ringing in his pocket after he had been shot. And so the Senate quickly passed the legislation because that was their brother. The desk was covered in black fabric and the rows, and they just were broken. When we got to the House, it was much different. We had to have a 2/3 vote, which is just such a high bar to cross. And so the speaker comes and says, okay, I worked really hard. We can bring down the flag, but they want to replace it with a different version. And I said, we can't have a different version. This has caused too much pain. It has to come down. A couple of days later, after major debate, he said, look, I did the best I could do. We're going to bring the flag down. We won't put another flag up. But they want to leave the flagpole up. Now, I've served in the South Carolina legislature. I knew exactly what that meant. What that meant was, as soon as all the TV cameras went away, they were going to go and put that flag right back up. And so I said, we're not going to have a flagpole. He said, well, I can't move them. This is the way it's going to be. So I went to go speak to them. And when I talked to them, and I talk about this in the book, I said, I want to tell you a story. And I told them the story about when my dad asked me if I wanted to go to Columbia, which was the capital city, if I wanted to ride with him. It was an hour drive, and I was like, yes, I want to go. I was all excited. And he loved to stop at farmer stands. He always loved to buy produce straight from the farmers. And we stopped by this produce stand, and he was getting fruits and vegetables. And I see the people at the register acting really nervous. And the next thing I do is I see them on the phone. And then 2 police cars fly up. And the police get out, and they go to them at the register, and they're looking at my dad. And my dad finishes what he's doing, and then he goes to the register, and he pays, and he thanks them. And we get back in the car, and my dad didn't speak to me the whole way home. And I know he was hoping I didn't notice. And I told those House members, I said, I'm governor now, and every time I pass that produce stand, I feel pain. No one that drives by our state house should feel pain. They went back in, they debated, and the flag came down. And the people of South Carolina stepped up in a way that showed true strength and grace to the entire world when you're faced with a tragedy.
You make a very personal revelation in the book, talking about the aftermath of attending these funerals, and mention that led you to have PTSD. Could you tell us about that and how you dealt with it?
Yeah, I knew, it took a major toll.
but I would go out and I'd do a press conference and I'd come back into the office and I would cry. I would come home and I would get right into bed and I would cry. And I would do my job. I threw myself into my job, but when I was away from the public or the cameras, I was just broken. And one night we had my chief of staff and her husband, who was our family doctor, over for dinner, and he said, "Nikki, you're showing all the signs of PTSD." And I felt so guilty. I said, "But I wasn't in that room. You know, that didn't happen to me." And he said, and I think what it was I knew too much of what happened in the room. And I think seeing the funerals and the open caskets and the grief and all of that, it just set in. And so I look at that video and you can see changes in my weight. I had lost 20 pounds and had gotten really thin. The press was asking if I had a new diet regime I was doing or if there was something wrong. And, we didn't say anything, but I did at that point seek help, and I spoke with therapists for many, many months to deal with that. And it was a lesson to me. I'm a military spouse. It was a lesson to me that PTSD doesn't just happen to people who are in the trauma. It can happen to people who are around and know too much of the trauma. And so I struggled whether that should be in the book or not, but I think it's too important to make sure that people understand there's different forms of PTSD and ways of grieving that we all need to be aware of.
Yes. Immigration is a topic you mention a lot in your book. How do you think the U.S. should strike the balance between protecting and securing our borders and preserving the American dream that brings so many immigrants here?
The fabric of America is legal immigration. I mean, it is why we are the best country in the world. It's what makes us special. And, I always tell people my parents came here legally. They put in the time, they put in the price, and they are offended by those who come here illegally. And I think what we have to remember is we are better when we bring in people of different cultures, different religions, different talents. That is what makes America great. But there has to be a process. Mm-hmm. And what's been so frustrating for me is that so many elected officials love to be out there and have sound bites and get on TV, but Congress needs to be in there debating immigration and how we're going to deal with it. We don't have enough judges to process. We don't have a way of vetting who comes into our country to make sure that it's safe. We don't have a way of securing our borders. All of these things need to be debated. And as long as Congress stays on TV and doesn't go into that room and debate it, the country's going to continue to be divided on this. And we all deserve a debate to happen. And I think that's the only way that we can see this going forward.
You mention in your book that you like to be underestimated. When is the last time you were underestimated? And I hope you don't say in this interview.
I've always been underestimated. It wasn't something that I wanted, but now it's something I actually appreciate, because I just think in every job I've ever had, I've been underestimated. But for me, I see it as a challenge. It's a great way to prove to people that they're wrong. And so, I was underestimated when I ran for the legislature the first time. I was underestimated when I ran for governor. I certainly was underestimated when I took the job for ambassador, but I don't think that's a reason to be offended. I think it's a reason to challenge yourself to work twice as hard to prove to people that you deserve to be there.
We've talked so far mostly about your time in South Carolina, and the story in your book has many interesting twists and turns, but can you tell us a little bit how you were plucked from the governorship of South Carolina to be our ambassador to the United Nations?
So I actually knew the president prior to being asked to be ambassador. After I won governor the first time, after I won the primary the first time, I got this white envelope with this great gold trim, and there was a support check, and there was a note that said, "You're a winner." And so it was from the president at the time. And so I had met with him on a couple of occasions, so I knew him. And then you fast forward to 2016, we had a lot of talent on that stage, 16 candidates. I put my name and support behind a different candidate, and it was about that time that he tweeted
Nikki Haley is an embarrassment to South Carolina. In which I responded in a tweet back to him and said, bless your heart. So I knew that when he's kicked, he howls. He knew that when I was pushed, I pushed back. There was just a respect we had for each other. And then, once he won the primary, I supported him in the general. And then I get a call from Reince Priebus. And Reince calls and says, Nikki, the president-elect wants to see you tomorrow morning in New York. Need you to come. And I said, for what? And he said he wants to talk to you about Secretary of State. And I said, Secretary of State? I said, Reince, I'm a governor. I can't be Secretary of State. And he said, well, he wants to talk to you about it. So I go to Trump Tower. Soon as I walk in, he says, well, I guess your guy didn't win. Because he can't let anything go. He can't let it go. So I give him his moment, let him relish in the win. And then I said, look, I'm not your person. I said, there's too much going on in the world. You don't need someone with a learning curve, but I want to be supportive of you. I'm willing to help in any way that I can to help you find someone. Fast forward, Reince calls back again a few days later. He said, don't say anything. I just need you to listen. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. I said, Reince, I don't even know what the United Nations does. I just know everybody hates it. He said, well, the president's going to call you on Monday. I need you to be ready with an answer. So my husband, I go home that night. My husband's looking on the computer, says, Nikki, I think you'd be really good at this. It wasn't the right time. My son had just turned 15. Our daughter just started college. My husband, Michael, and I, we take care of my parents. They're both in their 80s. They live with us. My mom has Parkinson's. So it was just not an easy time to move. So the president calls on Monday, and he said, all right, Nick, are you going to do this? And I said, well, sir, there would have to be some conditions if I'm going to take this. And he said, like what? And I said, well, after being governor, I don't want to work for anyone else. I would want to work directly with you, so it would need to be a cabinet position. He said, done. What else? I said, well, I'm a policy girl, so I'd want to be in the room when decisions are made, so I'd need to be on the National Security Council. He said, done. What else? I said, well, I'm not going to be a wallflower or a talking head. I need to be able to say exactly what I think. And he said, Nikki, that's exactly why I want you to do this. And he was true to his word from the first day to the last day.
I'd like to read one of the lines I love most in your book. You wrote, being an Indian American in the rural South in the 70s prepared me to be a Republican in New York in the 2010s. When you left the governor's mansion in the reddest of red states and you went to the capital of the bluest of blue states, what was that like for you and your family?
Culture shock. Culture shock. I mean, just to give you some idea, so I really almost didn't take the job because my 15-year-old, I didn't want to move him during what was, I thought, a sensitive time. And he said, Mom, you have to do this. And I said, okay, then what kind of school do you want? He said, I don't want to wear a uniform. They have to have a basketball team, and I want it to be really diverse. And I'm like, okay. So Michael worked on helping him find the right school. He gets to the school, and I knew that it was a totally new day when literally they closed down school for 2 days for grievance counseling because the president had won. I literally... I couldn't believe it. I literally could not believe it. But, what better way to prepare me for the United Nations than that, right? Except that was 192 against 1, so it was...
Speaking of the United Nations, you said when you were named ambassador, although you studied a lot for the job itself, you did not study the United Nations. Can you explain your thinking behind that?
So obviously, crash course in foreign policy. Learning who our friends were, who our foes were, what the conflicts were, and what goals we would want to have as solutions. But I purposely didn't study the do's and don'ts of the UN. And the reason I didn't want to do that is
I wanted to go in with fresh eyes. I wanted to go in knowing that I had some things to accomplish, but I didn't want to do it according to their rules. I'd rather ask for forgiveness. I knew that what I wanted was to make sure they knew what the United States was for, what the United States was against, and that there wasn't any gray area. I wasn't worried about making friends. I was worried about making sure that America was respected and that they understood that.
President Reagan was very close to his UN ambassador, Jeane Kirkpatrick. Were there elements of her service that inspired you when you were our ambassador at the UN?
So interestingly enough, I didn't know as much about Jeane Kirkpatrick when I took the job. And after I'd been in the job a year, we were on vacation, and I read a book about her, and I was shocked at the similarities of just how we thought the same. But also the relationship she had with President Reagan was very true to the relationship I had with President Trump. You know, many people ask how I got out of the administration without a tweet, right? And the answer is that I told him the truth. If he was doing something right, I fought for him, I rallied, I supported. And if I thought he was going in a wrong direction, I would call or meet with him and say, you can't do this. Instead, I would consider X. And he would always say, well, how do you see that playing out? And we would have a full discussion about it. And we were in constant communication and had a great relationship. But there was, I'll tell you a story if you want to know just a little bit about what it's like to work with the president. We were going to have our first high-level week, and that is in New York at the United Nations. 1 week out of the year, the highest members of every country come to New York for meetings on peace and security. And every head of state comes and gives their world speech at the UN. So this was the president's first world speech, and I was, excited and nervous for him, and I wanted to make sure everything was right. So he called me and he said, okay, Nikki, are we all set to go? And I said, yes, sir, I think we've got everything lined up. And he said, did you look at the speech? And I said, I did, it's fantastic. And it was. And I said, but Mr. President, I just want to kind of let you know what you're walking into. I said, the United Nations is a bit different. I said, they're a serious bunch. So when you give your speech, it's not going to be like a rally. I said, they're not going to clap for you, but don't take it personally. I said, I want you to think of it like church. He said, church, got it. He said, I want to ask your advice about something. And I said, okay, what? He goes, what do you think if I refer to Kim as Little Rocket Man in the speech? I said, Mr. President, remember the part I said about church? He said, I know, but I tweeted it out this morning and it killed on Twitter, and I just think it would go over really well. So fast forward to Tuesday morning. He has to give the speech, North Korean delegation in the front row. And then he says it. And you just see everybody, and you know they've got their translator pieces in, right? So all of a sudden you see them go. And then they start to laugh. So a few hours later, I'm meeting with the president of Uganda, and he says to me, Madam Ambassador, so what are we going to do about this little rocket man? By the end of the week, everybody referred to Kim as Rocket Man. Everybody. Right. It was amazing.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the subjects you addressed in the book on America's foreign policy. And in your book, referring to Saudi Arabia, you write, we can't allow our good relations to cover up extreme Saudi misdeeds. And we know that Saudi Arabia has continued this devastating war in Yemen. They are imprisoning and torturing women who led to the right to drive cars. There was a Jamal Khashoggi murder. And just this last week, there was the incident that took place in Pensacola. How can we better manage the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia?
So this is a really complicated relationship. On one hand, let's see, where do we pull this back from? I think on one hand, you have to look at the fact that the Crown Prince, who's now leading, is actually doing some very interesting reforms in Saudi Arabia. From their economic policy, it's been really strong. He's started women driving again, women going to movies and sporting events. It was announced just today that women and men are now eating in restaurants together. It used to be segregated. So from that side, you look at it and it looks like, oh, this is a country that's moving in the right direction. But then you look at the way they push down on their people. You look at the Khashoggi killing was horrific, and they can say all they want, they didn't know anything about it. That kind of thing doesn't happen. They knew about it. It was premeditated. It was disgusting. You can look at the other activity that they have, and it's of high concern. They are a strategic ally with us in defeating Iran and getting Iran and all the terrorist activity to go off. So the way to handle that is to push back hard on human rights abuses, killings, anything, in a way that they know we're not going to put up with this. This is not the kind of country we're going to deal with. But to also try and encourage them to continue on the routes of improving rights of women and doing those things. But it's a messy relationship. There's nothing clean and easy about it.
Are we pushing back hard enough?
I think we can always push back. I think when it comes to human rights, you never push back hard enough. When it comes to what happened in Pensacola, I really can't believe that we were allowing that training to happen without any vetting whatsoever. I mean, I'm a military spouse. The idea that they were working side by side. I mean, you can look at 9/11 and realize that should make us, we talk about vetting for immigration purposes. You have to vet who's on our military systems. Now, to their credit, they've stopped that training. That's not happening right now. But we really need to go back and revamp and look at all of that and make sure that we're doing everything we can to protect everyone on every, bless you. But I think that the Saudi Arabia part is something that we have to let them know we're not going to turn a blind eye to the bad acts that they're doing.
In 1987, President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev signed the INF Treaty. It eliminated the development of an entire category of nuclear weapons, short-range nuclear weapons. A copy of that treaty is here in the Presidential Library. What are your thoughts on America's withdrawal from that treaty?
I think that President Reagan would be obviously aggravated at the fact that Russia wasn't following it in the first place. I mean, I think if you look at that, the reason that we got out of the INF Treaty is because we were the only ones following it. And when you've got a treaty and you're the only ones following it, you're the one that's at the disadvantage, not everyone else. And so I think that pulling out of it, Russia can complain all they want, but they weren't following the rules. So now they're trying to say that it was us. I think instead we now have to renegotiate and get it back to where President Reagan wanted it to be, and they have to follow that.
If you could write a foreign policy prescription for neutralizing the threat that Russia poses today, what would that be?
We can never trust Russia, ever. We can never trust Russia. Russia will never be our friend, but we have to live with them. So how do you do that? First of all, they absolutely meddled in our elections. We know that. They know that we know that. And I think that we have to be strong on that part. But I think look at how they meddled in our elections. That's what bothers me the most, is here they were, and you had Russian operatives that went on social media and planned rallies that would divide our country on race and religion. And Americans showed up to these rallies that the Russians coordinated, not knowing that that's what happened. It's the biggest wake-up call for us to be conscious of what's on social media. It's the biggest wake-up call to not just believe everything that is on social media, but it's also the cheapest form of warfare. And it's not just Russia that's going to be meddling in our elections. You saw China meddled in Australia's elections recently. Iran is going to be doing it. We have to just make sure that we know They're going to always try and push negative narratives out there. We just can't fall for it. And then when it comes to Russia, they were the hardest part of my job at the UN. But I will tell you, there wasn't a bad actor in the world where Russia wasn't holding their hand. Whether it was Maduro, whether it was Putin, whether it was Maduro, whether it was Kim, whether you name it. They were there with Assad in Syria. They were always there because that's what gave them relevance. They don't have a lot of money. They don't have a strong military. So what they do is they align themselves with one of the biggest actors causing trouble in the world so that everybody suddenly has to talk to Russia. So I think we keep pushing back on them in the way that we continue to, supply Ukraine, the military, to defend themselves, in the way that we strengthen our energy because they hate that. We strengthen our military. They don't like that either. We become more energy independent. Those things are all pushing back on Russia, and that's what we have to continue to do.
Right. You mentioned Iran. How big of a threat does Iran present to us today?
Iran, I very much agree with Dr. Kissinger when he says Iran's not a country, it's a cause. Because they really do. Their cause is death to America. Their cause is anything related to the West. And what we saw, I think the previous administration was probably well-intentioned in doing the Iran deal, thinking that we have to stop the nuclear production. But they acknowledged it was nothing more than a stall factor. But what was so bad was Iran was already doing misdeeds. But with the Iran deal, what we did was literally give them a plane full of money. And all of a sudden, we allowed them to build the coffers of their terrorist activity and their surrogates. So now they were giving money to Hezbollah in Lebanon, to the Houthis in Yemen, to Hamas in Gaza. They were causing trouble in Iraq and Afghanistan. They were standing with Assad and Russia. And so once we pulled out of that deal and their coffers dried up, once we started sanctioning Iran, they now are at worse levels than they were before the deal. So Iran has a decision to make, and we don't know which way they're going to go. They are either going to go very extreme and try and do more terrorist activity to scare the world into doing what they want, or they're going to come back to the negotiating table. The goal we should want is to isolate them. And when I say isolate them, not just the United States, the world has to isolate them. The Europeans have to acknowledge the fact that they're continuing to test ballistic missiles, that they're supporting terrorism, that they're selling arms to the Houthis in Yemen. If we isolate them, I think we get them back to the negotiating table. If we're doing this just one-off, I think they do the terrorist activity. What we have to let them know is we won't be scared into making decisions. We will make our decisions based on strength, not on fear.
I know we were able to give you a very quick tour of the library, but throughout the library are examples to the love and partnership of Ronald and Nancy Reagan. And you mentioned in the book your husband, Michael. And could you talk a little bit about the impact he has had on your career in politics? And specifically, I didn't know this till I read the book, that you were the only governor who had a spouse who was deployed during your governorship.
He left me as a single wife, mom, governor, deployed spouse. I could have killed him just for that, right? So, I met my husband my very first weekend at Clemson. He's been my only boyfriend. We dated for 7 years. We've been married for 23, and obviously my best friend. But when he got deployed to Afghanistan while I was governor, people always said, well, why, you could have stopped it. Why didn't you stop him from going? And I said, because he would have divorced me if I would have stopped him. It's in their blood. When you're in the military, you wait for that call. And, he got the call, but it was not always the easiest time. The first 3 months, one of the kids was crying every night. And there was one morning where I was getting the kids out the door, and my son had to dress up for school, and I was trying to put a tie on him, and I couldn't get it to go on. This is normally something Michael would do. And what's worse is it was a clip-on tie, and I still couldn't get it. So I go outside, and I call over security detail, and I go, can you help me with this tie? I can't get this tie. And so the security detail says, yes, ma'am, I'll help. So he gets it on to Nayland. I kiss his cheek, send him on his way, turn around,
go to open the door, and the door is locked. Now, I am in my robe in the front of the governor's residence. I just know a TV camera is going to arrive. And I'm sitting there looking at the security cameras like, come on, guys, hurry up, hurry up. It feels like I was out there forever. And all of a sudden, my daughter opens the door and goes, Mom, why are you outside in your robe? And I said, I got locked out. And she said, I'm late. I need something to wear. So I go and I get her out the door. And I go and I put on social media what not to do to get locked out of the house, getting the kids out in your robe, getting the kids out the door. Didn't think anything of it. Got dressed, went out, different security guy picking me up. And he said, Governor, I'm so sorry you had a tough morning. And I said, oh, did you see my social media? He said, no, it was on the news. And I look at my phone, and all of a sudden, my press office is going, did you just tweet that you were locked out of the house in your robe? And I said, yes, why? And he goes, because Channel 4 News wants to see the video. And I'm like, no, we're not going to do this. So the next thing I know, Good Morning America, Today Show, CNN, everybody's talking about me getting locked out of the house. And I get an email from Michael that says nothing but, really, Nikki? No, but you know what? He's the person that, regardless of what job I have, he keeps me balanced. When I need to fight, he encourages me to fight more. When I need to pull back, he pulls me back. He keeps me humble. And more than that, we continue to have fun. So I'm grateful for him.
In your book, you describe what you call your 24-hour rule and how it has served you well in your career. Could you tell us about that? And have there been times that your 24-hour rule has not worked for you?
So 24-hour rule is a rule that I gave myself after realizing that mistakes can happen. And, you know, 24-hour rule, especially if you're in public service, things that can happen that everybody implies the sky is falling, or the sky really is falling, and you're having to deal with it. And so I apply a 24-hour rule, which is sit back, wait 24 hours, and then make the decision you need to make, if you can. A lot of times you can't wait 24 hours, but usually that takes the emotion out of it. And 24 hours later, you're thinking about it in a totally different manner. And so it really was, you know, my foray into politics was learning that, look, everybody needs a 24-hour rule, because then you're just much calmer and much better about making decisions going forward.
Got it. We're just about out of time, but there's a question I wanted to ask you to wrap up. Ronald Reagan once said that being governor of a state was the best preparation to be president of the United States. My question is, Governor Haley, do you agree with Ronald Reagan?
Dude, that's such a wrong question, especially knowing we've got press in the room somewhere. Look, I'm not going to disagree with President Reagan. I'm just not. I'm not. Being governor is interesting because when you're governor, you can actually move the ball. You know, when you're in Congress or in the legislature, you're making the sausage. It's not pretty. When you're governor, you tell them how to make the sausage and you get it done. And so I will say it is really good at teaching you how to make decisions, make strong decisions, and living with those decisions, but also creating a culture, getting people invested, learning how to communicate in a way that people will buy into you. And so, yeah, I mean, I think being governor is one of the best jobs in the world. You know, I was blessed to serve the state that raised me, and it taught me a lot of lessons along the way, and clearly it did something right for for Governor Reagan, who turned out to be a fantastic president.
Yes. You have a tradition, I know, at some of your appearances of doing a selfie with the entire audience. Would you do that with us tonight?
So we've had some pretty good selfies, I'll tell you this. So we have to see how the Reagan selfie measures up to the other selfies. You know, we did the Nixon selfie yesterday. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask everybody to stand up and hold up your book. And then we will do the same thing, and this will be out on social media so that everybody can see the Reagan selfie.
All right.